I come before you in the hottest place I could find to offer my thoughts on Dune, the movie. I already did the book. The first thing you might be wondering, regardless of what side... Oh, he flips. The first thing you might be wondering, regardless of which side of the coin you're on... The first thing you might be wondering, regardless of which side of the coin you're on, is how does this appeal to non-book readers slash book readers? Because I'm a book reader myself. And I think the first question, the answer is, it's the same. This movie is pretty light on dialogue and story, which the novel is not. So as a reader of things other than Dune, or just someone who doesn't read at all, you're going to get very minute explanations that aren't fleshed out at all. It's just enough to keep the plot going. And so it's going to be kind of lacking in that regard. But if you're a book reader, you have the opposite problem because you're looking for all these things to be developed. You're just like marking off. They left this thing out. They left that thing out. That. Where's all the plot and world building? So I think it actually comes out even. I talked to a few people who are on both sides of the coin just to see what their opinions were. And that's, I think that's where we're all at on the matter. I don't think being a book reader or a non-book reader is going to affect your judgment of this movie or your enjoyment of this movie in different ways, because both parties are going to have their own issues with what's going on here. But let's start on the positive before we get to the critique here. Because Dune does something amazing. Dune, the movie, accomplishes the best visuals and accompanying music in perhaps all of movies. It's certainly up there contending. You see a lot of artistry in like small budget art house movies where it's like, oh, that looks really good. Look at the colors, look at the direction, the framing, the cinematography. That's a good word, cinematography. Look at all these things, but they're on really cheap budget. Like A24 does not spend $200 for a movie. That will never happen. So in that regard, what we have here is really interesting. We have a movie that has the artistry visually of a $5 million movie, except it has 20 times the budget. Most of this movie was just kind of spent in awe of looking at how it looks. It's like that scene in The Last Jedi that's just there for like a split second, and then everyone in the theater and everyone afterwards like, ooh, that was the one good part of that movie. It's up there. I'm putting it up there so you know what I'm talking about. But even without putting it up there, you know what I'm talking about. It's like that, except that's the entire movie. We're just constantly sitting like, oh, amazing. A more contemporary and extremely obscure reference at this point was, 3 years ago, there was a Brad Pitt movie called Ad Astra, which almost reminds me of, where that movie was all visual. Like the story and the characters were super bland, but it had really good visuals. But once again, it was not a super big budget. It was more than like an art house movie, but it was not $200 million. So if you took Ad Astra and gave it a $200 million budget, that's Dune. It's gorgeous, it's imposing, and it's the word I was using was I'm just vibing with it. I was vibing the entire movie because it's not just the visuals. You have Hans Zimmer just going crazy on the score, and so this entire movie, it's just like this like chanting sci-fi. Everything's huge and it's stark brutalism. If you're just familiar with architecture at all, that's very brutalist everything, and it was cool. It was really cool. It's the kind of movie you just want to sit there and just look at it for a while, which is good because now we're getting on to the second part, in that there's not a lot going on outside of the visuals. Like just start with dialogue. This movie is shockingly light on dialogue. I mean, I'm willing to bet that there are short films that have more dialogue than this 2.5 hour movie. It's just not the concern, and it really, and that's the critique, because there needs to be. We need to have more story. We need to have build up. Every character is just sullen and completely downplayed. Like Paul, our main character, Paul Atreides, he's not a character. Some people might point to the books and say, well, Paul was probably the weakest part of the books too. Sure, but Paul was the weakest part of the books in some really good books. Paul might not have been amazing in the books, at least the first one, but he had a character. He felt emotions, and he did character things. Here, I mean, it's a complete flat line. There's one scene in the movie when he hugs Aquaman. He's seeing Aquaman for the first time in weeks, and he gets excited and he hugs him, and that's the only time his face makes an expression in the entire movie. Aquaman makes this kid happy for 10 seconds, and it was just like a little like sigh of relief where I go, oh, he's not a robot. Speaking of Aquaman here, Jason Momoa was the only actor in this movie to emote, or at least emote well. That'll be a thing to talk about here. He needs to be in the movie more because he's the only one acting. He's the only one like doing anything where you're like, I like this guy. He's the only likable character. Not only is he the only likable character, he's the only character that you have an emotional reaction to one way or the others. All of the heroes, you don't really care. All of the villains, you're like, yeah, you're a bad guy, I guess. So you need that. You need all of that. And the only other emotional character would be Paul's mother, which is just like morose, sobby woman, which for book readers, that's going to just feel really bad because she's the least emotional character in the book in like a really cool way. And so I'll do another video talking about this movie in really great depth here because it needs to be dissected on just how wrong it went in places and some of the choices here. There's a few action scenes. I don't think they're explained all that well or executed that well from the sci-fi perspective because everyone has swords and shields. At no point does the movie just say why they have all this stuff or describe how it works. But at the same time, even if you've read the books, it doesn't always follow the rules, it seems like. Like, you get some, like, really quick sword fights where Aquaman is just hacking away at people. And you're like, that's not how it's supposed to work. But, once again, for non-book people, you don't know how it's supposed to work. So you're like, just cutting people with shields on somehow. Both sides of the coin, you're going to have some sort of problem. But the action scenes, they're fast-paced. They're well shot enough. And those are exciting. There's not a lot of it. It's by no means an action movie. Holy crap, no. But, it's exciting as it can be for not really caring about the characters. And I guess that's probably the best thing you can say about the action scenes is that Aquaman, I'll call him Jason Momoa, Khal Drogo, I'll just switch it up every time. Khal Drogo is the sword master. He's the house sword master in the book. So in the movie too. So he is the action guy. So the one guy that you care about at all is the one who's doing most of the action scene. He's the one doing all the stuff that you want to root for. So luckily, on that level, the action scenes, because if you have an action scene where your character, well, that really is hot. If you have an action scene where you don't care about the character, you're not going to care about the action. You have to be rooting for them. So luckily, if nothing else, we're rooting for the guy doing all the cool sword fighting. And outside of that, once again, I said not a lot of dialogue. It almost comes around to being a benefit because the sound mixing is so bad. There's a lot of dialogue here that I don't know what they said. I want to watch this movie again with subtitles. It is that bad at points. Like Tenet last year. Was that last year? Ooh, almost screwed up on dates. Last year with Tenet, Nolan did it, where his just sound mixing was so bad, no one understood. But at least it works better here, because there's not a lot of dialogue in the first place. It's paradoxically, but the movie is both better and worse by having no dialogue and no exposition and people talking. And that's the thing. I saw a YouTube video where Christopher Nolan was interviewing Denis Villeneuve, I think that's his name, about this movie. So if Christopher Nolan was an inspiration for how the dialogue was mixed in this movie, screw you, buddy. We need to tear these two apart. If they're friends now, we need to get these two together. We need to get Villeneuve away from Nolan before his corrupting influence ruins the future of sci-fi movies. That's not even like a complete joke. Like, it's the one thing that any movie should be able to do well is know what your characters are saying. And historically, that hasn't been a problem except for Christopher Nolan. And all of a sudden, this movie pops up, and I'm like, I saw it in a big theater. Maybe it'll be better. But once again, this is a movie you want to see in a big theater because it's so big. That covers the basics. It covers the basics. So who will enjoy this movie? People probably should stop doing this. I'm sitting quite close to the camera here. So, who will enjoy this movie? People who love atmosphere, who just want to like stay in the world. Like Avatar a few years ago. It's almost like a new Avatar. Dune is the new Avatar. Except instead of neon, it's grays and oranges. So if you just... Except Avatar didn't have like a great soundtrack. So in a lot of ways, this is the better Avatar, okay? If you just want to sit in the theater for a good 2 hours and 10 minutes of just sitting there being like, yeah, this is cool, then yeah, this movie's for you. And I certainly enjoyed it on that level. And I say 2 hours and 10 minutes because it's a 2.5 hour movie. It's about 7 minutes of credits. And then there's about 10 minutes where it goes a little long. It's 2.5 hours, but for the most part, doesn't feel that way until you get to the last 10 minutes. Where you're like, okay, can we just, okay. It goes 10 minutes too long, which for a 2.5 hour movie, 10 minutes too long, that's fine. I'm not going to take off points for that. So the big question, how good is this movie? How do you compare something that is amazing audio and visually, love the soundtrack. How do you take something like that and then with like little to no story, or a story that was executed poorly, characters that you don't care about? I'm giving Dune the movie a 6 out of 10 for above average. 5 is average. Most movies are 5s for me. Dune's a 6. Dune is above average. But it's a high 6. I want to give it a 7 because I'm really vibing with it. I want to just sit in the theater again and just sit there for like 2 hours of just like... Which, if you've seen the movie, that's actually apart from the movie. That was the coolest part of the movie. The sacrificial throat singing. You're like, it was spooky. It was released for Halloween. That's a good choice. It had one legitimately spooky part. So yeah, high 6 out of 10. I really want to see the second part, but I also want to see improvements. And mostly I just want to stay in the world more. That's why I want a second part. This is not the definitive edition of Dune. People are saying like, oh, it's Lord of the Rings, it's Star Wars, it's the next huge franchise. No. This is no, it's just not. And I don't think it should be. I think in the future, in 20 years from now, in 40 years from now, when we finally get a definitive edition of Dune, I hope it'll take some inspiration from the art design and some of the like the tech and like the world choices here and just how cool it is. But this is not the definitive edition of Dune. This is a Dune where we're going to get a nice trilogy, I hope, and it's going to be really cool, and you're going to just love to chill in the world, but you're not like super invested. That's my knee. That's my knee. And I guess that's my review for Dune. That's really the tagline, if you take anything away from it, is that Villeneuve, he could have made this movie with any property. He could have wrote an original sci-fi. He could have taken Foundation or Stranger, and probably not Stranger in Strangeland, that would have been weird. But he could have taken any big sci-fi idea and made the same movie. And for all extents and purposes, what you get out of the movie would have been no different. There's no reason this had to be a Dune movie. And that's the takeaway. It's a good movie. It's an above average movie that's really enjoyable aesthetically. It's a shame that there's no Dune in it.